Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sarah Whiting. I'm the Dean of Harvard University Graduate School of Design. I want to begin by acknowledging that the Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now Cambridge and Boston. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present and future, and we honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. Before we jump into tonight's event, a quick reminder that we have live captioning available for our virtual audience, because yes, it's not just you all. There's a virtual group as well, somewhere there out in Webland. There's also teaching going on behind me. To enable captions, please click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your live stream window. I also want to invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs because it never ends here. On March 28th, that's Monday, at 12:30 GSD time, architect Anne Lacaton of the Paris-based firm Lacaton & Vassal will be delivering the inaugural Jacqueline Terwitt Urban Design Lecture. That afternoon is also the start of this year's two-day Cambridge Talk Symposium organized by our PhD students and entitled Post-Defense Dissertation Research Beyond the PhD. We have two additional public lectures next week. Indigenous architect Sam Oblickson will be giving the Rachel Dorothy Tanner Memorial Lecture on Wednesday evening, and Lima-based architects Sandra Barclay and Jean-Pierre Krauss will be speaking about transversal grounds on Friday at 12:30. So all information can be found on the events page of the GSD website. Thanks for closing the door. Welcome to tonight's keynote address, Designing AI Ethics in Practice and in Public, to be given by Dr. Molly Wright Steenson. As I believe every one of you knows, this evening's talk kicks off the next day-and-a-half symposium, which is organized by Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, entitled Bringing Digitalization Home: How Can Technology Address Housing Challenges? And before anything else, I'd like to recognize Joint Center Director and GSD faculty member, Chris Herbert, who organized this symposium with Deputy Director David Luberoff. I'd also like to thank the entire Joint Center staff, as well as the GSD event staff, for all of their work in ensuring smooth sailing. It's never as easy as it looks. I'm also so very excited about this symposium because it's the first conference that we've had in the school since the world closed down in March 2020. And what an appropriate topic to bring us back. For over these past 2 years, digitalization has kept us home in more ways than we ever could have imagined. Thankfully, this conference goes way, way beyond Zoom, bringing together a diverse group of scholars, practitioners, policymakers, and civic leaders to discuss how digitalization, that is, the use of technology to create, collect, process, organize, analyze, use, and monetize digitized. It's a hard word to keep saying over and over again, data, has spurred fundamental changes in all aspects of housing, from how homes are planned, designed, built, and owned to how people find, finance, and live in them. Symposium participants will assess whether those changes might further or hamper efforts to address economic, social, and environmental challenges such as housing affordability, discrimination, and climate change. And since AI is increasingly playing a role in even how investors decide what to buy or how lenders decide who gets a mortgage, symposium participants are likely to be grappling with many of the ethical questions that Molly will discuss in her lecture this evening. Our speaker tonight, Molly Wright Steenson, is, according to her website, girlwonder.com. Yeah, you heard that right. girlwonder.com. She's a writer, professor, historian, designer, and leader. And as if that weren't enough, Molly is also Vice Provost for faculty at Carnegie Mellon University, where she's been on the faculty since 2015 as the K&L Gates Associate Professor of Ethics and Computational Technology, so you can guess why we chose her to give this talk, and an Associate Professor in the School of Design. Molly took a somewhat unusual path into academia. In the mid-1990s, she was one of the first people to focus on user experience and content strategy for websites on the then new internet, including Netscape and Razorfish. As she is fond of saying, I was one of those people who architects love to complain about. Someone who had architect in their title, but who wasn't trained to design buildings. Now, I've actually had an argument with Larry Lessig about this very topic because, she can say she's an architect, she's an information architect, and because I'm not licensed, I can't say I'm an architect. So, yes, so she was information architect, then she was a consumer experience architect, among other positions. In 2005, Molly left Silicon Valley to go back to school, and she eventually got a doctorate in architectural history at Princeton, where her goal was to bridge these different notions of architecture. Having been at Princeton when Molly arrived there, I will say that that may have been her goal. Our goal was to kind of change up the PhD program by admitting Molly, which was a bit of an experiment, I have to say. Given that she did have such a very different background, obviously, given her path, she had a fabulous time at Princeton and did a fantastic job. So I'm really pleased to see her in a different role. Her PhD ultimately led to a 2017 book, Architectural Intelligence: How Designers and Architects Created the Digital Landscape, which Molly describes as a deep dive into the work of Christopher Alexander, Harvard graduate who recently passed away, I think this week, Cedric Price, Richard Saul Worman, the MIT Machine Group, and Nicholas Negroponte, and the ways that these figures harnessed early AI, cybernetics, and information architecture, inspiring programming languages and cutting-edge technology to the present day. Much of Molly's more recent work has been about AI ethics, which is the focus of her keynote this evening. And as she notes, just as the design of user experience for AI and its related technologies are vital concerns for architects and designers, so too are questions about ethics in AI. The keynote, she continued, will explore whether AI ethics in practice and in public is really about ethics, and also discuss the role that design can and has to play in the decisions about AI and ethics. I think we all can agree that it couldn't be more important than talking about ethics when it comes to digital information right now across all boards, and certainly in the housing sector. And so this is, we've gone from a world where the idea of digital in housing was the Jetsons, which is the version I grew up with, to how it can absolutely control aspects of the housing market and our lives, daily lives within, and the pros and cons of that. And that's some of what I think Molly will share with us tonight. Molly will give her talk. I'll talk with Molly for a little bit, then we'll open it up to questions. So you can start ruminating on those questions as soon as she starts speaking. Thank you. Welcome, Molly.
Hi, what a pleasure to be here. This is my first live talk in 2 years. I got on an airplane this morning at 4. No, I got on the plane at 7, 6. I don't know. I don't know what time it is, but I think that's what I want to say. But it is a total pleasure to be here with you in person, and I thank you so much for having me. Sarah, thanks for the wonderful, wonderful introduction. So I want to start by telling you about a conference, and I want to set this scene a little bit. It's a conference that took place just down the street with some of the most important researchers in computation and architects. There were about 500 people there. I think there were 76 students, so some from here, some from the other places around town. The Graham Foundation funded it. And the goal of this conference was to alert the profession to an irresistible force which will radically alter the practice of architecture, whether we plan for it or not. And at this conference, one of the big questions was that of architecture, creativity, ethics, and the future. I couldn't go. It wasn't because of the flights. It's because it was 7 years before I was born. Some of the things that this conference talked about included, we may have lost an opportunity for leadership. It is coming through the back door to architecture. It's coming through the back door to the building industry, while the architect takes a back row seat. And so here we are today to see what is in store for the future and to see what, if any, is the role of the architect in the computerized world of tomorrow, recognizing that tomorrow is here today. And I think this is just as true in 2022 as it was in 1964 at the Architecture and Computer Conference held at the Boston Architectural Center in December 1964. I point this out. That's a bit better. I point this out because I think it's important to realize just how long we've been framing and reframing these questions about computation, architecture, and ethics. And I also want to underscore the role that architecture has always played in these conversations and the ways that key individuals in the field of artificial intelligence going back to the very beginning held hands closely with architecture in order to take up those questions. So just a reminder, although many of you in the room may be aware of this, the term artificial intelligence is something old enough to get Social Security. John McCarthy coined the term in 1955 and described it as making machines do things that would require intelligence if done by people. We could go back to Alan Turing, who, of course, popularized the idea of the imitation game, in which he said, "I propose to consider the question, can a machine think?" We talk a lot about machine learning when we want to differentiate between artificial intelligence in the big picture and the technical details. Well, we've been using machine learning since 1952, even before artificial intelligence. Arthur Samuel coined the term, and he said, "The programming of a digital computer to behave in a way which, if done by human beings or animals, would be described as involving the process of learning." And then, of course, Marvin Minsky, who was on panels at the Architecture and the Computer Conference, wrote in 1961, "I believe that we are on the threshold of an era that will be very strongly influenced and quite possibly dominated by intelligent problem-solving machines." So let's go back to the Architecture and Computer Conference. A couple of these statements in the proceedings are just phenomenal. Henry Millen said, "It is we who must define the objectives, we who must evaluate the proposed actions with respect to desired objectives. Most of our actions result ultimately from an ethical choice, be they political, economic, or social. We cannot shirk the responsibility of such a choice." Later, he said, "In a period where young designers shy away from moral or social philosophy and theoretical statements of objectives while seeking only solutions to immediate and limited concerns, will the computer as an objective analytical technique divorced from social objectives and ethical concerns play an increasingly greater role?" There was a question from the audience. Someone wanted to ask Marvin Minsky something specific and said, "Professor Minsky, would you comment as to whether the computer can handle questions that are in essence ethical questions, or is this actually the role of the human being?" And Minsky had words. He said, "How can you leave value judgments to humans when you don't agree with most of them? If there were another entity which also makes value judgments, you may disagree with it too. You can have rules against computers, but this is bad philosophy. What is a good ethical judgment?" And I find myself in those words thinking about what I hear in Silicon Valley as people push back against ethics, and as we see questions come up over and over about what should be allowable with algorithms and maybe what shouldn't be. So I did promise you that nothing is really truly new. And even when I go to Google this morning, like I did, and I type in AI is the new, these are some of the things that come up. And indeed, AI is the new electricity, the new UI, the new black, and a new paradigm that unites humans and machines, to name a few. So why is it that whenever we talk about AI, we talk about newness? Why is it whenever we talk about AI, we come back around to ethics? And why is it whenever we talk about AI, we talk about imminence and immediacy? It's baked into it all. And I'll talk a little bit about that here today. The great ethics boom. Around 2017, a couple of things began to happen. One is that the term big data gave way to the simpler acronym AI. The other is that discussions of ethics began to blossom and bloom everywhere. And I've been really curious about why. I think there might be a number of reasons why. And I'm going to delve into them a bit here. One, I think, has to do with the emergence of the self-driving vehicle and discussions about it as Uber's ascendancy in the marketplace began to happen. This is a fleet of Uber ATG vehicles in the Strip District in Pittsburgh. This is about a mile from my house. That's the 31st Street Bridge, I think, right there, or is that? I think that's the 31st Street. I'm a bad Pittsburgher, I can't tell you. But as we looked at the implications of self-driving vehicles and what would happen, and then when someone actually did kill a pedestrian, when a self-driving vehicle driver didn't pay attention and killed a pedestrian, we of course see this happen. This is what Madeline Ellish has referred to with her collaborator Tim Hwang as moral crumple zones. But I think a lot of it lends itself to another kind of ethical framing, the trolley problem. Chances are you're familiar with this, but just in case you're not, I'll introduce it to you. There's a trolley going down the track, and in front of the trolley are 5 people tied to that track. There's someone, you, who is at the switch. That's right there. And you have a choice. You can throw the switch, and the trolley will just take the spur and run over 1 person, or it goes straight and it kills 5. What's the right thing to do? Just quick show of hands. Who throws the switch? Okay, we got some nice utilitarians in the room. Well done. It's an ethical framework. Who does not throw the switch? Okay. Who wishes that I wouldn't answer, or I wouldn't ask this question and try to use this as a framing for exactly? But let's kick this up a notch. Now, you are standing on a bridge. Next to you is a large person. You could throw that person over the bridge. Nobody would be able to tell. You'd stop the trolley, and you'd save the people. Who would do that? I didn't make these up. Actually, 2 female philosophers, Philippa Foot is the person who came up with the original trolley problem, and Judith Jarvis Thomson from MIT came up with what is referred to as the fat man problem, the variant that you saw with the bridge. And they did this to draw into relief a number of ethical conundrums. Interestingly enough, in the case of the original trolley problem, it was about the morality of abortion. Now, we all kind of groan, I think, with the trolley problem. If you're like me, I do at least, because it just seems like an oversimplification of the ethical trade-offs that we have with algorithms, robotics, and computation. A lot of people laugh about it. Some of you might be fans of the TV show The Good Place. Here is, this is Chidi, who is he's in the middle, he's an ethics professor, and this is about the worst thing he can imagine, because he can never make up his mind. And he is living the trolley problem in this particular scene. It's really a great show. I recommend you watch it if you've never seen it. There are trolley problem memes. There are entire meme groups. I'm very pleased to say I have a trolley problem mug now. I hunted it down and I got it. Here's my favorite trolley problem meme. And there are some other solutions to the trolley problem that I think are really serious that we should maybe consider.
uh-oh, Nicholas, this train is going to crash into these 5 people. Should we move the train to go this way, or should we let it go that way? Which way should the train go?
Uh-oh.
24 million views. We're learning from the youth. They are our future. So we do have this problem of problems and of simpler ways to talk about ethics and complicated ways to talk about ethics. And with the great booming of ethics in 2018, I've wondered why. Why ethics? Why is this how we're choosing to talk about it? And a few things were going on in 2017, 2018. One, for instance, one example is when Salesforce was working with had a contract with Homeland Security, and more specifically Custom Border Patrol at the period of time where Trump was separating families at the border. Salesforce has a celebrated open culture at the company, and employees wrote to Mark Benikoff and Keith Block, the co-CEOs, to say they couldn't stand with this. I have heard rumors that the other thing going on was that all of the speakers started pulling out of Dreamforce, the enormous Salesforce convention that happens every year. Or there's what happened at Google. Google had an engagement with the Department of Defense with Project Maven, and Project Maven was using computer vision algorithms and in partnership with commercial tech companies to parse the data from drone flights, and the thought was that this could potentially be used on the battlefield. So people who had worked on TensorFlow and other algorithms and other packages at Google were not in support of this idea. 4,000 people signed a petition, and there were walkouts. Google responded with a set of 7 AI principles. And they're kind of small. I think you can see them, but they include things like be socially beneficial. They're very small on this screen. I think it's easier if I look up. Be socially beneficial, be made available for uses that accord with the principles here, uphold high standards of scientific excellence and whatnot. I looked at this when this came out and thought, what use is this really going to be? But around the same time, a number of other kind of ethics principles frameworks started being published. And I know that there are at least 300, and it's probably a great number more now, of frameworks and toolkits and manifestos and oaths specific to AI and ethics. Also coincided with people becoming a chief ethical and humane use officer, for instance, at Salesforce, which had the problems with the protest about Customs Border Patrol. Our friends just down the street here at Berkman Klein have done this fantastic framework showing the different kinds of themes that are in different AI ethics frameworks. And even the DoD has a set of very straightforward ethics frameworks for AI that are honestly pretty hard to disagree with. Responsibility, AI should be equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. But the question that we continue to have is, how do these make it to the public? And beyond that, what does ethics mean in these different circumstances? So we convened a team at Carnegie Mellon with Vandana Subramanian, who is a senior this year in machine learning and computer science, Jonah Conlon, who grew up down the street here in Cambridge. He is finishing his Master of Design at the School of Design, and Nick Martellero, who is an assistant professor in the Human Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon, as well as some friends in digital humanities with the libraries. And we wanted to parse a lot of materials, so we looked at 9 9,000 articles on medium.com to find the intersection between AI, ethics, design, governance, regulation, big data, machine learning, algorithms, and robotics. And in that parsing, we wanted to see what was common and what was different. And we found that, maybe not surprisingly, human, AI, bias, and moral are top terms in every category except for big data. Not sure why not big data, but we'll just go with it. And we also saw consistent uses of society and social, weapon, technology, and principle. Design referred to morals and society, but did not pick up questions of principles, virtue, or philosophy, which makes me wonder what use the toolkits or different ethics declarations really are. Another thing, oops, no, do not press that button. There we go. Another thing that we see is that it reinforces the role of the human, right? And the way to look at this is to do the opposite. If we looked at the most algorithmically centered articles, they were all about algorithms, about tech. There were no people involved in them. But when we started looking at these questions of ethics, the role of the human programmer or developer or engineer or user was implicated. And so we see humans being a part of these ethical conversations. It sounds obvious, but I don't think it is. We took it a step further, and I'll move quickly here, toward a distant reading. We looked at almost 14,000 articles from a number of publications to pick up the coverage of AI and ethics in the popular press. We were curious, these different kinds of ethics pronouncements, these frameworks. What did they do? What did they do with the public sphere? Did they move the needle? Did they get people talking about them? And it turned out that among nearly 14,000 articles, these ethics frameworks didn't really make much of a dent. We saw 868 mentions across 617 documents, and AI and ethics only co-occurred in 400, and only 25 articles were about ethics principles. And this little plot here, I'll point out that the number, that the y-axis just goes up to 16. So there might be a term frequency here, but we're not talking about a lot of use. We did find that ethics in conjunction with conversations about big tech did happen, and we found that it was when things were not going well. It happened with controversy, not surprisingly. With Facebook, questions of accountability, bias, morality, data and discrimination, and privacy. Zuckerberg shows up alongside responsibility, or maybe lack thereof. I guess I maybe should be careful about dissing him on his home Harvard turf, but maybe you'll stick with me. And Google, looking at questions of bias, algorithm, and AI. So what do we see then? We see that ethics are about the humans in the system, but that ethics principles might be controversy cover, and that the public cares about controversy but doesn't follow ethics principles. Now, to be clear, I think that ethics frameworks are a good thing, although we don't really know whether they're any good, or who they're good for, or whether they're even ethics. They don't usually define them. Ethics can act as a window dressing or a mask, no pun intended, for the misdeeds of companies. Can serve as a checklist. It could be a hedge against litigation. And this isn't new either. Hannah Clark wrote in Fortune in 2006 that companies often hired chief ethics officers as a hedge against as something that would be beneficial if they were sued, particularly for white-collar crime. If they had a chief ethics officer, juries and judges were likely to go easier on them. At least that was the idea. Ethics as an attempted hedge against regulation. There's Mr. Zuckerberg. And a number of other practices. This is via a number of works by Luciano Floridi at the Oxford Internet Institute. There are a number of practices like ethics shopping, trying to look around for a better ethics framework. Ethics blue washing, sort of like greenwashing. You make it seem as though something is more ethical than it is. Ethics lobbying, and we could just go back one slide to see an example of ethics lobbying. Don't regulate us. We are better to regulate ourselves. And that's the general ethics lobbying. Down to things like ethics dumping and ethics shirking. Could you work through a third country? Could you work through a third set of practices, or just shirk your duties altogether? I find myself thinking about crisis communication and public relations. So looking at the roles that, the different roles that crisis communications play and the ways that they're at odds. This quote, I'll just read it aloud. In times of crisis, communications professionals and lawyers often pursue conflicting agendas. Communications strategists are inclined to mollify public anger with expressions of concern, while lawyers warn that contrition can be construed as admissions of guilt in potentially expensive lawsuits. And we see this play out in a lot of ways. Anyone who's followed what happened at Google or follows ethics at Google is probably aware of Timnit Gebru, who was an ethics and AI researcher, co-leading an ethics and AI group there, and was fired. And it was quite a controversial thing. Her co-lead, Margaret Mitchell, also was fired. And as we keep seeing this statement, Google says it's committed to ethical AI research, but its ethical AI team isn't so sure. So how does this play out in practice if we move beyond ethics pronouncements? First, the whistleblowers. Back in October, you might have been aware of Frances Haugen at Facebook, formerly of Facebook, going before Congress and sharing things like the toxicity of Instagram for teenage girls, or the polarization of polarization of content and misinformation that the algorithms supported, and more about the ethical issues behind Facebook. So she's a whistleblower that Facebook instantly tried to discredit. One approach is rebrand. Facebook is now Meta, and this is the metaverse, and they say connection is evolving, and so are we. Jury may be out. Another set of approaches, though, in practice are embedding AI and ethics into the design and engineering process. And here, I want to call out some of the different practices that are in place. For instance, consequence scanning. This is an agile method in which, in a workshop setting at an early phase in a design project, the intention is to figure out what you know and what you don't know. What are the unintended consequences of a product or a feature? What are the positive consequences that the group wants to focus on? And what are the consequences we want to mitigate? This is from .everyone. It's a UK-based organization, and they share this as a kind of pamphlet in PDF form with directions on how you might include this in an agile workshop or another design kind of sprints. I'm going to show Salesforce again because, interestingly, they actually do support some very good practices in AI ethics and design, and I'm curious about how we might take this up in a conversation about architecture and about housing, noting that this is deliberately in the digital sphere. If you aren't familiar with Salesforce, you won't realize that this is what their branding is like, but this is directly from their website. They run a set of practices called Ethics by Design, and they share how to look at this positive impact as well as mitigating the negative impact. But a lot of this has come from a person named Kathy Baxter, whose job title is Principal AI Architect. She's not an architect. Just feel like I should say that. But she has given thought about how to embed AI practices in a way to make it accountable in the engineering process. I'm hoping you can see what's up here. I was pleased to see that this information that I had from her as a conversation a couple years ago had become publications, not just in research, but in practice on the Salesforce site. So as Kathy explained it to me, there's a maturity cycle in AI ethics, and her 4 steps of it, which you see here, are as follows. First, there's some kind of issue. We've seen this in some of the examples I've given. And someone in the organization who has both visibility and credibility brings it to light. Then that person is given a position in AI ethics, and a set of principles is published. That person is given probably a second job title and no resources. Then the principles become actionable in the engineering process. They get tied into the agile process. They can be tracked as in that way. And if you're looking at what's under managed and sustainable, you'll see some of those practices. And then fourth, the practices have incentives and tooling behind them. And that also means that when an ethical issue comes up and a bug is filed against the software, that if you don't take it on as a team, you will block the launch. So that's this last area here, poor ethics metrics block launch. And it's creating what is referred to as ethical debt in the system. I also mentioned that Salesforce, Google, and a number of research organizations share something called model cards. So they find ways to share the models that they're developing and to create this kind of accountability in the engineering process. So what about in public? I think there's a question of how we might better recognize the stakeholders affected by AI and algorithms. And I've been curious. I think, a couple of years ago I would have been a lot more cynical, but there are a couple of things to share. First of all, the White House has started an effort to create a Bill of Rights, an AI Bill of Rights, and behind that there is a request for information for biometric technologies. And these are the kinds of changes that were made once upon a time about the environment back in the 60s and 70s. The White House back in November had a number of different events for their Bill of Rights for an automated society. This particular event was about the criminal justice system. And then this is quite recent, last month or so, the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2022, which is sponsored by Wyden, Booker, and Clark. So, and this is really quite interesting. So what they say is what makes these are researchers from Data and Society writing in Slate. They say, what makes the current regime hopeless is not that companies are incentivized to remain ignorant, or at least they claim to be, about the harms they expose us to, lest they be found liable. And so this requires impact assessments when companies are using automated systems to make critical decisions, and it provides consumers and regulators with much needed clarity and structure around when and how these kinds of algorithmic systems are being used. These are then submitted to the FTC, which is keeping a public, once cleaned, keeping a public repository. So there's direct accountability. So as I begin to close here, I wanted to talk about going there and back again to 1964, to 2022 and beyond. You'll remember that we had this conversation with Henry Millen, who said most of our actions result ultimately from an ethical choice, be they political, economic, or social. We cannot shirk the responsibility of such a choice. We have a question of the role in the public sphere And as Jürgen Habermas said, and I read this book, I feel like I should say, in Sarah Whiting's Most Fabulous Architecture in the Public Sphere class in 2007, the public sphere is made up of private people gathered together as a public and articulating the needs of society with the state, the coming together of individuals to a public sphere to share their concerns. And there's so many different configurations and theories of public spheres. Agonistic public spheres, counter-public spheres. I think some of us even question whether there is a public sphere these days, or whether we have splintered and polarized beyond them. I feel like I'm going to do a PS after this last slide. This is for David. A shout out to someone who was at the architecture and the computer conference. But I do see that these are old questions and new questions, from ethics booms to accountability and to the public sphere. And the final thing I'll say here is that this question, there was a mention of Christopher Alexander, and Christopher Alexander passed away last week. Architects have had a, I think, maybe contorted relationship with Alexander, but he was also one of the speakers at Architecture and the Computer. And he said something that might be interesting for us to take up. He said, anybody who asks, how can we apply the computer to architecture, is dangerous, naive, and foolish. He's foolish because only a foolish person wants to use a tool before he has a reason for needing it. He is naive because, as the 1,000 clerks have shown us, there's really very little that a computer can do if we do not first enlarge our conceptual understanding of form and function. And he's dangerous because his preoccupation may actually prevent us from reaching that conceptual understanding and from seeing problems as they really are. So maybe that is a good way to honor Christopher Alexander's passing and to ask us to question what the bigger picture here might be as we look at algorithms, as we look at AI ethics, housing, and the public sphere. Thank you.
Super. You've remained a good student. No, that was very clear and very interesting. I mean, I think I've a couple questions that and they aren't necessarily in a particular order or with a specific end. I mean, one of the first that comes to mind that didn't come up that surprised me was your framework for seeing the rise in the discussion of ethics and AI starts in 2016 and peaks in 2017 or 18, and it seems like one of the contexts certainly was the presidency here, right? So, I mean, if you're looking at, and I guess that led me to wonder how much of this is, how much are you looking at the American context where there's, I think that probably was a very direct peak and moment, or the European context where they actually, it seems like, if I remember correctly, they were taking on essentially how do you find forms of regulation or accountability for the digital universe?
It's on, great. Certainly the European model is different, and there was greater data accountability. There's even the question of the right to be forgotten, as one might be able to have there. So the framing today is from the perspective of, is largely from a Silicon Valley perspective. But, yeah.
I mean, I think that the other thing that came to mind along those lines is there's essentially what I find very interesting and exciting about what you're touching on is you're watching a process of a world trying to grapple with finding shared principles, as you mentioned at points, finding essentially legislation advancing, and you see the world of law or regulation forming in front of us with something that's very intangible and yet very, very impactful, right? And I think that I found it interesting that as you were talking, we moved from the term ethics, then accountability comes in a little bit later, right? And it did make me, and then I think your ending with the public sphere obviously made me very happy. But I think that there's a latent desire behind this that is, again, I think we will bring the question back to AI and more specifically, but I think there's a larger issue of a sort of desire to find a way of finding some shared foundations among human beings and some belief that maybe the digital data can do that. And so I find it fascinating when you use the term searches, because that's, I think, a common means of trying to find common denominators, right? And this desire to say, look, we can find something that we share and build from that foundation. And so I guess part of my thinking is that there's this, there's essentially an optimism in the digital, in AI, that holds this belief that it can still find a version of a public sphere or a version of accountability or a version of an ethics. And yet it always seems to be elusive, just as Habermas's public sphere was, right? It's sort of, we're constantly, as a human species, being, aspiring that we can find some means of common ground that we will agree to and behave properly, and then finding that being elusive. And so I guess that's a larger context, again, of this shift to accountability and to the larger issue of sort of human desire to find this common ground.
There are a number of things in there, I think, to take up. So that shared human experience question, that's something that the web, Web 0.0, my old web, was good at doing in a number of ways, but it also probably didn't have the diversity in every way that digital networked technologies have now. I think what gets problematic is when algorithms shape what happens in those digital agoras. I'm someone, full disclosure, I have 4,500 friends on Facebook. But I've been working with online communities since 1992, so I guess that makes sense, right? On the other hand, I've had to stop using it lately. I think
it's the glasses.
Yeah, it's the glasses, yeah. It's X-ray specs. But there's something else here that, this question of law and regulation is very much an architectural and a design question, because it's where we meet those decisions. And I think in questions of housing, for instance, I'm very curious about where tomorrow's conversations will take us, because it's where we live, and it's often people who might not have, it's highlighting the power structures where we live. One thing to note about ethics is that these ethics frameworks started showing up. I should have mentioned this during my talk. And then they began to be replaced with responsible innovation, Microsoft, responsible AI, Microsoft and Google, and sort of framing in that kind of sphere. And I think that you can't underestimate the questions that are legalistic around risk mitigation or that are public relations around communication. And that shift, I feel like somewhere in there it must have come from saying, we can't we can't adjudicate ethics, but we could do better if we could reframe this as responsible innovation. I do want to give a shout out to some interesting work going on from a master's student who I've been working with named Nandini Nair. Her work is on mutual aid and trying to find patterns within mutual aid organizations and different ways that we might see that come together. Again, she's looking at wikis and patterns as a way of doing that and not something top-down algorithmic. And I think that's what we come back to, is the way that things can open up and be put in many people's hands.
It's super interesting. I want to be respectful of time, and I've got you all are monitoring any Zoom questions coming in, right? Yeah, Chris is. Yes. Okay. Excellent. So please, our Zoom customers, ask questions if you want to be using that internet bandwidth. I wonder if we have any questions in the audience. You want to open it up to questions from the audience. I warned you I'd be asking you. Please.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it and found it very thought-inspiring. I suppose as I'm thinking ahead to the coming days, how do you think about what you've spoken about? How do you see it interfacing with the built environment and particularly housing? I wonder if you could speculate a bit about how you see your work integrating with that.
I think by asking some of these same questions about what the interface is between the built environment and regulation. My own work, I'm lucky that I don't have to give a paper tomorrow. So I think I'm here more as a provocation, but what I hope is that some of the things that I'm putting into play will be big enough picture items to take up in the broader conversations tomorrow. But a moment ago, I was talking about the question of power differentials around housing, and also the question of scale. And I'll say, in terms of the talks tomorrow, I'm very curious about in a post-redlining future. What do we need to watch out for? There are the stories of Zillow. There are the stories of well, Jacob and I were talking about WeWork in passing, and the potential for any number of emergent models to tank entire housing markets. So I'd be getting ahead of myself if I tried to guess too much, but these are questions I've got. And I'm wondering how also we might be better able to shape some of these questions about AI and ethics through a housing lens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that historically the question of ethics brings in housing brings up changing ideas of good intentions, right? And so the idea that some big moves were well-intended, or so I think of an example of the Lake Meadows housing project in Chicago that was done by SOM in 1960, I think. I can't remember now. And it was meant to be a fully integrated housing model of middle to essentially middle-class housing, but it was meant to be racially integrated. Very well-intended, and without the means of pulling that off in terms of, sort of the complexity of what that meant or how that could actually happen in American society weren't really digested at that point. And that's an easy example, right? I don't know if I want to put good intentions on urban renewal broadly, but one could with attempts at sort of slum clearance and sort of saying, well, we don't want people to live like that, but then the consequence of not adequately rehousing. And so this issue of who's defining what are ethics at different moments in terms of housing specifically, I think is one issue, maybe to answer Will's question. So.
And the question of paternalism, which is kind of baked in. A couple of weeks ago, I went to the Campbell iron soup housing developments. I think it's the first prefabricated or first, poured concrete. I want to say it's 1920s. It's Campbell, Ohio, Campbell soup plant. And it's largely fallen apart now. It was for African American residents, and tied into the history of Youngstown, of the Rust Belt, and of good ideas gone astray. I think there are questions and problems. I think there's also, I find myself thinking of the connection of garden cities and Silicon Valley tech campuses. They're sort of envisioned in the same kind of way, where one was, imagining what could happen, what Raymond Unwin was thinking about, in terms of plans for entire communities. These get taken up and taken over in ways that I don't feel so comfortable with anymore.
Or, I mean, thinking of a very contemporary notion of if we think of housing today, how do you sort of, again, an optimistic view would be that the digital or AI could help us with the fact that we don't have necessarily nuclear households anymore. So the possibility of building in variety of occupation. The issue is the models of variety that you can build in always bump up against the reality of hard walls. And so I think this is where one of the issues of ethics in housing falls into play, is that the idea that you could use a machine for helping you offer up perfect varieties, but then you still have the ethics of living with the consequences, I think is at play. So I don't know if these are some of the issues that will come out in the conference, but I think that it's ultimately it boils down still to a question of who defines one's ethics. Where is the accountability? I mean, you can talk about ethics till you're blue in the face, but then you have the issue of accountability, and is accountability a fear of a lawsuit, partly what you were talking about with the sort of blue washing, or the notion of hiring a ethics person to make it look like you're thinking about ethics. Is it a question of a fear of lawsuits, or is it an accountability problem that is simply the challenge of how do you hold someone to ethics? Jacob and then Sean. It's a Zoom audience.
The Zoom folks hear you.
I want to keep them awake.
Right. Actually, maybe building on that, question I have is, do you see any consensus emerging around where responsibility or liability rests when it comes to automated or autonomous systems? With the end user, with the designer, and if not, are there any useful precedents or from previous eras or industries that might point a direction for how we could approach that question?
Well, that's what's so fascinating about this bill from Wyden and Booker and Clark, that that accountability will actually, it's about accountability, and it's about holding users, holding the companies to task, holding them to account, and requiring them to audit what they're doing socially or ethically, and registering that with the FTC. I don't know when this bill will be coming to a vote. It's up now. They have just announced it at the beginning of February. But if this happened, it would be the first time that we start seeing that movement from what we know is right into something that actually holds companies accountable in a way that they haven't been previously. And so I'm hopeful that that will go forward. I don't know what the likelihood is, but I'm hopeful. And that's where you start to see it. Like that's where it begins to make a difference.
Sean.
So just going back to where you started in the discussion about everything old is new again. It does strike me that a lot of what you've talked about is imposing a regulatory system. Speaking as a policymaker here, imposing a regulatory system on new things largely, right? That you have for the first time, we're creating an act bill. But I think in the housing world, what I've come up against a lot is, and in other spheres as well with digitization, is a pre-existing regulatory system that never even conceived of the ways in which that system might need to be thrown out. And that all the legacy problems, so for example, Airbnb coming to housing regulatory systems, Uber coming to taxi and the list goes, fair housing with, what all of these algorithmic things will change in terms of mortgages. And I'm just curious whether you think that is a fair characterization, or you think there are other regulatory schemes you've seen that have to adapt to this new technology in ways that we might learn from in this conference, not just how we can build new systems, but to adapt old systems of regulation into the new reality?
So this is definitely more your territory than mine, but I would look at environmental questions in the 50s and 60s. I find myself thinking about seatbelts and Ralph Nader, Princeton, and as a historian, I am someone who looks back in order to frame and to try and understand what the longer threads are in here, or at least the longer ideas. I am curious, post-pandemic and now in this economic moment that we are in / about to be in, with a war in Europe and the price of gas going up and the price of durables going up and everything going up, where we're actually going to land. Uber drivers are quitting because they can't afford it if the cost of gas is too high. What happens then with that kind of surplus-based platform economy when there isn't a surplus? On the other hand, there's a way that things can flip. In Ukraine, Airbnb, there's a way to give to people in the Ukraine by renting their Airbnb apartments and not showing up, right? But getting the money to them. That was something that was going on. So a secondary use or tertiary use of a platform. So I'm curious about what kinds of things begin to emerge in that capacity.
Okay, now you guys are cooking with
popcorn.
gas. So
This is very
Jose
good.
Luis, Yvonne, and then back there. Oh, inside too. And you even have Zoom people. Okay, we're moving. Start us off.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Molly. Very interesting lecture, very provocative. I feel I'm going to get kicked out of this room for what I'm about to say, but what are even the ethics of architecture? Like, I feel there's all this conversation about we want to put a framework to decide whether if what we do with AI is going to harm people, is going to have a positive effect, is going to... But I feel the conversation has ever happened with the accountability of architects and the way we change the world and we affect people's life, because I know many people who are very miserable in the house that they live in, and I'm not sure that any architect was legally indicted because of the ethics of the bad work that they did, Have you ever found a case study or...
Sure.
I don't know.
What about post-occupancy evaluation? I think of the work...
Is that even a thing anymore?
What? Well, here or somewhere else. So James Garrett Jr. is not only my boss. My boss is James Garrett Jr. But the other James Garrett Jr. is one of 15 Black African American architects in Minnesota who are licensed. Minnesota is where I'm from. I've known James since we were 6. And so Jimmy and I have known each other since grade school. But he runs a practice called Formula, and it's an architecture and public art practice in the Twin Cities. And that notion of post-occupancy evaluation, and also knowing how the buildings he designs are used by their residents. Quite frequently, it's housing and housing for people of color, or in some capacity, social housing. And public art and landscape in the Twin Cities is a really vital thing. So I wonder about that. Or I could look at the work of Erica Cochran-Hameen, who's my colleague at Carnegie Mellon. Actually, she's also a Black African American, and she studies air quality, and a researcher, but from kind of the Department of Energy funded side of things in architecture. So I think they are there. Whether they make it into architecture schools with thriving HTC programs is maybe another question, and I'm in a really pretty different kind of campus since Carnegie Mellon is really heavily technical. But I do appreciate taking those questions up, and I wonder what they might look like here. Some of these questions aren't digital, and that's great. We've got that question from Christopher Alexander that I threw in for David at the end, the statement about, designing a problem for a computer is a silly way to go about designing a problem. I think designing with people in mind is an ethics that I can get behind.
Yeah, I think architects end up being accountable for a lot of things, a lot more than they should be, frankly, in terms of if you think of what liability they have to carry for a project. But I think that's where the question of when you say something is bad, was it bad because the ceiling fell, or is it bad because it's aesthetically ugly? Which I think we should be able to regulate. But I think, in other words, the question of what you mean by ethics, Luis, isn't necessarily clear, because certainly in terms of health, safety, and welfare, the regulations are in place for architects. But it's a provocative question.
Can I build on that just very quickly? One of the things that distant reading, that text analysis that we did found is that you figure in the human when you start to talk about ethics versus, if you're just looking at algorithms, you're figuring in the code. I went to architecture school in the years where formalism was in the wane, but not gone. And it ran counter, I think, it ran counter for me to a lot of things that I think about, because I think about people. So I think about people as inhabitants and residents, and I wonder what it begins to look like if we design for a resident or a human, and not a regulation.
So the seminar you didn't take is my other seminar on formalism. So we can talk about that
your
further at dinner.
That's going to be dinner.
But I think that the issue of what is regulated is key. Yvonne.
Well, actually building on maybe topics that are complicated, but that also link up with tomorrow's topics. So unlike the industries that you've described and you worked with, which are actually industries, maybe Roger and I might say that construction is not an industry. And because it's not an industry, it's also very data poor. There's not a lot of data culture. So I'm just struck by your very insightful point that I forgot, which is big data is AI. So there is no big data in construction particularly. We don't know very much about what goes in buildings, actually, particularly in the US. Is that an advantage at this point or a disadvantage when an industry is so data poor and has a kind of shadow? The only other industry that's as data poor is waste, as my colleague Dietmar Offenhuber has shown in his research. So construction is data poor. Is that a good thing or a bad thing in this age of AI?
Depends on who you ask. I could imagine that there would be a lot of people who are very happy to have construction be data poor, but I could also look at some of the researchers I know from the School of Architecture at CMU, at Carnegie Mellon, and I think they are actually heavily connected to data and construction. So I want to say you should go talk to them. But yeah, it's if you don't have data, or you can own the data and obfuscate the data, you can do all sorts of things with your arguments. And yeah, I think
that's where there's still a side to this, which is sort of impossible for me to get my head around, which is when you get people, even in hearings of Supreme Court nominees, who repeat things that have not been said and who constantly sort of make these claims that's just one version of ethics gone awry, and you feel like, okay, you should be able to prove that something like that is wrong, and how can we, so if that's not possible to regulate the communication or sort of use AI to explain that we have communication mishaps or false news, then how do we possibly regulate ethics in architecture? So that's where my head explodes. But we have more questions in the audience. Yes, you had a question a while ago, and you deserve the mic. So
I'll hand it back.
But behind you.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm a student here, and you mentioned that public awareness has only really occurred in the wake of controversy, with these issues, and I can't help but think that such a bill like the one you propose would actually be more likely to pass should this discussion be broadened. However, even as a student, I find myself struggling to understand some of the terminology. So how do you and your work make this discussion more accessible to the broader public, and that way the bill could actually, people could be informed in this bill that's meant to serve them?
Thanks for that. I think that that's really. Do you have a follow-on?
Yeah, I want to build on that, but we can go either way. But fundamentally, what I wanted to say is, instead of a regulatory perspective or an architectural perspective, let's explore this in terms of an end user perspective, what the end user experience is of these data points in construction, in real estate discovery, in so many different areas. As Sean Donovan said, the gap between the legacy data environment and the present is really huge. So I want to put it in one pithy term, which is somebody has to design consent, because consent and community are the missing components here of the data revolution that's actually taking place today. Because it's no longer about the acquisition of data and big data. It's actually about how the community around data is being established and considered. So instead of it being top-down by government, top-down by architects, I'd like to hear what you have to say about, and this is building on her perspective, is how we look at it as a bottoms-up capability.
Absolutely. And a lot of this, I think, is there are a whole set of talks and writings that I've done that are much more based on some of the examples that come up, because I'm really curious about where tech meets where we live our day-to-day lives, where we experience. And so, I almost want to, I've thought about almost creating a book that's just the stories of it. The hand soap dispenser that will dispense on a white hand or a sheet of paper, but not a black hand or a brown hand. The HP webcam from 2009 that would follow a white face, but not a dark face. And there are funny examples of these, of videos of this online, and sure, they're humorous, and at the same time, the HP example is a Radio Shack salesperson saying, this just goes to show that HP computers are racist. And it puts a point on what these issues are. It brings them home. It makes them understandable. And that's what we're actually doing when we're doing some of these things. When a sensor that dispenses soap into your hand shuts someone out, that's also like an algorithm making continual mortgage decisions against black would-be homeowners over and over and over and over and over again, to the tune of 10 times higher than white or Asian homeowners or Hispanic would-be homeowners, very equal amounts of rejection. So I think finding the human stories in there, you're exactly right, it's absolutely beneficial, and it is beneficial to think about that top-down and that bottom-up. Data comes from people, and Johanna Drucker makes a distinction between data and capta, right? So data is from the Latin for to give, and capta is to take. Well, if you're having your data taken from you, then what?
Yeah, and I would just underscore, I think your question was very good in terms of there's that aspect of the public data being taken, but I think part of what you were asking about was how do you get this conversation, how do you get people to understand the importance of this issue and get this conversation out there, which I think is a really key question for democracy today, right? And that bill is interesting to me because I had never heard of it, right? And so a Senate bill so I do think that That's a very, very interesting point, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and others on how we might find broader audiences for questions like this. So I think it's a really key point that you're making. We have more questions inside. Oh, and we'll get to our Zoom audience after.
So in 2020, Google's subsidiary Sidewalk Labs pulled the plug on its Toronto waterfront revitalization project. And while this was due to funding and cost-cutting reasons, there was also a growing negative sentiment amongst the residents of Toronto that their data will be stolen and that their privacies will be breached. What do you think is a better way of implementing smart cities, especially with all these developments happening across the world, Masdar City in Abu Dhabi or NEOM in Saudi Arabia, for instance. And based on your expertise and practice, how can these companies sort of regain the trust and excitement of the public about living, just the idea of living in smart cities?
I want to give a shout out to Malls Sauter, M.R. Sauter, S-A-U-T-E-R. Their work is on, they wrote a really great piece for The Atlantic about Sidewalk Labs, and then a more recent piece about its demise in Toronto, which is where they did, where they were living when they were doing their PhD. But I point that out because there's all sorts of rhetoric about those kinds of places and the glowing, pretty renderings, and then the reality and what it means for innovation culture. But I find myself thinking of things like the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago, which has been around for 50 years. Down the street from where I used to live, and the notion of communities being involved, of communities figuring out what they have at stake. I could point to the PhD dissertation of my my former student Dimeji Onafua, who is now actually working at Google, but he was looking at questions of commons as and could data be a commons, could tenancy be a commons, and trying to reconfigure what we think of in those kinds of ways. So that's a bit of a different approach. It's I don't think Arup can turn and then go build a new city in the desert somewhere, but I think it brings us closer to residents and people at home.
I mean, it's partly a question of scale, I think, is how you're responding, and that's interesting. Let us turn to our Zoom audience.
Thank you, Sarah. I do feel the weight of obligation to represent all those at home. So I have several questions. So
translate that data.
So I might throw out two just because I have the mic and I'm representing the whole world out here. One is from Andrew Witt, who unfortunately couldn't be with us in person. Andrew. He asks, AI may significantly disrupt labor markets, particularly in the architecture, engineering, construction sector. Are there any models to think about AI as a more collective asset?
AI as a more collective asset. Yes, and I've got to think about what they are, but why don't we take that as a joint provocation, all of us, to bring into conversation what are the reconfigurations of AI as a joint asset? I would add that AI needs data, as somebody pointed out, big data. We flipped from big data to AI around 2017 in terms of how we talk about things, but you need the data. So what then is that common asset?
And one other question, also from a faculty member, which I think is a good, bringing back to your observations about the 1964 conference. Mm-hmm. So as you look back at that conference, what did they get wrong? And are there any lessons from their conversation for where we are today?
Well, Minsky's got a heck of a legacy, and his questions about ethics. I want to just kind of be careful here, but you do a little bit of looking around, and it's a lot bit problematic about his legacy and some big questions raised. So that's something that we got wrong. I haven't so much been. When I look at architecture and the computer, which I keep going back to over and over, I think for what they got right, they got the contours of things right, but you know, we're also looking at something back in time, 60 years, 55 years, whatever it is. So they've situated computing and architecture as, you know, for calculations and risk management, for representation, and eventually for generativity. And I think there's a history of architecture over the 20th century that might look at those three elements. I think that's something that it got right. I'm eager to know of things that it really, really got wrong, though, so please do share them if you know.
Did you have a question? Yeah. And this might have to be our last question, so it better be good.
I'll try to make it good. I'd like to build on a couple of the comments and questions that have preceded this one, and reflect a little bit on the provocations that you've talked about, which I think are a really good way to set the stage for the conversations over the next couple of days regarding housing in cities. Some of the examples, maybe many of the examples you've given, have a tendency to focus on a company, on a particular agent or entity that has control of the technology, the decisions they're making about that technology, and you know, some responsibility and hopefully accountability eventually for the ways they employ it. But in the conversations we'll have in the next couple of days, we'll talk about much messier situations in which it's not just a single entity, unless it's perhaps Sidewalk Labs on the waterfront of Toronto trying to make a community. But cities are messy democratic places with lots and lots of stakeholders, different municipalities with different aims, some of them exclusionary, some of them inclusionary, different levels of governments having different roles to play, citizens that may or may not want different types of neighbors in their community, and so forth and so on. In that context, where we're dealing with a messy democratic process, where power and institutions are very much at play, and technology tends to reinforce power discrepancies that pre-exist, can we find an optimistic note to think about using AI technology to help bridge some of those gaps and overcome some of those discrepancies? Is there room for optimism in your way of thinking about all this?
I am probably optimistic about technology, given that I'm still working on these topics, but I'm critical about them, critical about it. But one thing I find myself thinking about is the work of David Hendry and Batya Friedman in value-sensitive design. Yeah. I'm glad to see people excited about their work. Batya's a rock star. I don't know David, but I do know her a bit. And what value-sensitive design, for those of you not familiar, does is it's a way of looking at the value tensions that stakeholders have, because they do exist. And they put forward a three-part model that's conceptual, empirical, and technological. So if you're going to look at the impact of, a webcam on a town square that beams back to Sarah's office so she can have a window when she doesn't have one, what are the implications for the stakeholders who are caught by that camera as they walk by? How do you balance that against everyone else's needs? I am not a math person, but I do know that solving for more than two variables gets complicated, and you've described an infinite number. So I think all we can do is return to that idea of what a public sphere is. I find myself actually thinking a bit of Bruno Latour and the idea of the parliament where we bring together our hybrids and we come and sort them out together, and we do that value sorting together, and we understand that it isn't going to come out in the wash, but we work within it. And I think that a digitized future, or a digitalized future that does that is a fair one.
I would share that I think we have to harbor a certain optimism. I think that's what's interesting about this moment is I think we've gone through wild optimism about AI and ethics and architecture and housing and everything. And we've been hit hard when things have gone bad, whether it's Airbnb and Uber or whether it's other models. And I think or politics today. Am I allowed to say that? Yeah, I don't care. And I think we are at a moment where we've sort of hit such a rock bottom in terms of ethics that there is still optimism that those 45,000 friends may not be real friends, but that there is some way of forming something with the data that we have that can be positive. And I certainly think that the next day and a half is going to point to some things that are optimistic, because you've gotta. I mean, that's I hope so. So
4,500.
Oh, I thought it was 45,000.
No, that's just scale. That's what AI does too. It scales everything up.
All right, that's a good moment to end. Thank you very much for
Thank you.
a fantastic opening talk.
Thank you.
Thanks.